Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep History. Tonight we're travelling back to the glittering court of Versailles, where dinner wasn't just a meal but a brutal performance that could make or break your entire life. So get comfortable and let's drift into the past. Imagine it's the late 17th century and you've somehow been invited to dine at the Palace of Versailles. At first glance, everything seems magical. The candlelight bounces off endless mirrors. Gold ornaments cover every surface, and servants glide silently across. Marble floors carrying silver platters piled with food. But before you even sit down, you're already being judged. Your clothes, your posture, the way you walk, even the angle of your bow. All of it is being silently evaluated by hundreds of eyes. At Versailles dining was never private. The king himself often ate in front of an audience, a ritual known as the Grand Couvert, where ordinary nobles and even curious commoners could stand and watch the monarch eat his meal as if it were theatre. Every bite he took followed strict rules. The order in which dishes were presented, who was allowed to hand him his napkin, who poured his wine. All of these tasks were assigned to specific nobles as enormous honours. Now picture yourself trying to navigate this world. The seating arrangement alone could destroy your reputation. Where you sat reflected your exact rank in the court hierarchy, and sitting in the wrong chair, or even hesitating to long before sitting, could be seen as either an insult or a desperate grab for status above your station. Whispers would spread instantly, and your social standing could be permanently damaged before the soup was even served. Then there's the food itself. Meals at Versailles consisted of dozens of courses, sometimes more than 30. Served in a specific sequence with specific utensils. Forks were still a relatively new invention, and not everyone used them the same way. So even the act of eating could mark you as either refined or hopelessly uncultured. And despite all this extravagance, the kitchens were often located so far from the dining halls that food arrived lukewarm or completely cold. Yet you were expected to eat it with enthusiasm and grace regardless. Hygiene was another shocking aspect. Despite the perfumes and powdered wigs, Versailles had serious sanitation problems. The palace housed thousands of people, but proper bathrooms were scarce, and the smell throughout the corridors was often described as overwhelming. Many nobles simply relieved themselves in hallways or gardens, all while wearing elaborate silk gowns and powdered faces. The contrast between visual splendour and the grim reality beneath it was staggering, and as a guest you had to pretend not to notice any of it, maintaining a calm, composed expression no matter what odours drifted past you during your meal. Now let's talk about conversation, because even talking at the table was a minefield. You couldn't simply chat freely with whoever you wanted. Strict rules dictated coutume based on rank, and initiating conversation with someone above your station without proper introduction was considered deeply disrespectful. Meanwhile, staying completely silent could make you appear dull or suspicious. So you were forced to walk a constant tightrope, speaking only when appropriate, on topics that were appropriate, in a tone that was appropriate, all while balancing a heavy, uncomfortable outfit that restricted your movement. Speaking of outfits, the clothing worn at Versailles was its own form of torture. Men wore tight coats, stiff collars, and heavy wigs, while women were laced into corsets so restrictive that breathing deeply was nearly impossible. let alone eating a 30-course meal comfortably. Fainting was common, not from emotion, but simply from the physical strain of standing for hours in these outfits while maintaining perfect posture. And if you did faint, you'd become the talk of the court for weeks. Your weakness whispered about behind painted fans. Then there was the issue of time. Meals at Versailles could last for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. You couldn't simply excuse yourself early, no matter how exhausted, hungry, or uncomfortable you felt, because leaving before the king or before higher-ranking nobles was considered a serious breach of etiquette. So you sat there, hour after hour, watching course after course arrive, forcing smiles, nodding at conversations you couldn't fully participate in, all while your stomach growled and your legs ached from sitting in rigid formal posture. Even something as simple as using a napkin had unspoken rules. How you held it, how you wiped your mouth, even how you folded it afterward. All of these tiny gestures were observed and judged. One wrong move, and rumours would spread through the palace by morning, distorted and exaggerated until your reputation was in ruins. Imagine spending years building your social standing, only to have it crumble because you reached for the wrong fork. And beyond etiquette, there was constant political danger lurking beneath the surface. Dinners were where alliances were formed, rivalries played out, and secrets exchanged through subtle glances and coded words. A single misplaced comment near the wrong person could end careers, ruin marriages, or even lead to exile from court entirely. Every smile masked calculation. Every compliment carried hidden meaning. And every dish served was part of an elaborate social chess game where the stakes were your entire future. So when we romanticize Versailles as a place of glamour and luxury, we forget that for most people who lived through it, every single dinner was an exhausting, anxiety-filled performance where survival meant perfect behaviour, constant vigilance and an iron control over your own body and emotions. Night after night, for years on end, and this constant performance took a real toll on people's mental and physical health over time. Courtiers often described feeling permanently exhausted, not from physical labour, but from the sheer mental effort of maintaining composure every single moment they were in public view, which at Versailles was almost always, since even hallways and gardens were considered semi-public spaces, where you had to behave with the same careful formality. Sleep itself became a luxury, because court life often demanded late-night gatherings, early morning ceremonies, and constant readiness in case the king or queen requested your presence at any hour. Many nobles survived on very little rest, relying on thick layers of makeup to hide exhaustion, which only added to the strange, theatrical nature of daily life. Now, let's talk about the food itself in more detail. Because despite the abundance, eating at Versailles wasn't always enjoyable, with so many courses served in such specific order. By the time interesting dishes arrived, many guests were already full from earlier courses they were obligated to at least sample. Refusing even food you didn't like or couldn't eat for health reasons could be seen as an insult to the host or even to the king himself. So people often forced themselves to eat things they found unpleasant, sometimes leading to discomfort or illness afterward. And despite the palace's reputation for luxury, leftover food was often handled in surprisingly careless ways. with scraps sometimes left out for hours in warm rooms before being cleared away, creating conditions that modern health inspectors would be horrified by. Another overlooked aspect was the noise, with hundreds of people gathered, plates clinking, musicians playing, servants moving constantly, and quiet conversations happening everywhere at once. Dinners could become overwhelming sensory experiences. For someone unused to this environment, it could feel disorienting, almost like trying to focus in the middle of a crowded festival while also being judged for every twitch of your face. Lighting added to the strangeness too, since the palace relied entirely on candles, meaning rooms were often dim, smoky, and filled with the smell of burning wax mixing with perfumes, food, and unfortunately less pleasant odours from poor sanitation. By the end of a typical Versailles dinner, most guests were not relaxed or satisfied, but quietly relieved it was over, mentally replaying every interaction, every glance, every comment, wondering if they had said or done something that would come back to haunt them socially the next day. A private anxiety hidden behind the polished, smiling masks that court life demanded from everyone every single night, without exception or rest, and this hidden anxiety often followed people long after the meal had ended, lingering into sleepless nights, spent replaying every small interaction over and over. Even the walk back to one's chambers after dinner could be fraught with tension, since hallways were filled with other courtiers also processing the evening, exchanging final remarks, forming quiet alliances, or quietly tearing apart someone's reputation through subtle gossip disguised as casual conversation. For newcomers to court, this could feel like stepping into a foreign country with invisible laws, where everyone else seemed to instinctively know the rules while you were left guessing, terrified of making a mistake that everyone else would notice immediately. Children born into noble families were trained from a very young age in these customs, practicing posture, table manners, and conversation skills for years before ever attending a real court dinner, because the margin for error was so small that even a single childhood mistake could be remembered for decades. Foreign visitors fared even worse, since they often arrived unfamiliar with French customs entirely, and despite genuine attempts to honour their hosts, simple cultural misunderstandings could be interpreted as deliberate insults, creating diplomatic tension that sometimes affected relations between entire countries. Even the seemingly simple act of receiving food could become complicated, since servants followed precise choreography when presenting dishes, approaching from specific directions, holding platters at specific heights, and waiting for subtle signals before serving, meaning a guest had to remain alert at all times, never quite able to relax into the meal the way people do today. Wine service followed its own elaborate rituals too, with specific glasses for specific drinks, and refusing a poured glass, even if you didn't want to drink, could be seen as rejecting the generosity of your host. So many guests quietly sipped drinks they didn't actually want throughout the entire evening, and underlying everything was the ever-present awareness of the king's mood. If Louis XIV, 15th, or 16th seemed irritated or distracted during a meal, that mood would ripple through the entire room, with courtiers adjusting their behaviour instantly, becoming quieter, more cautious, more careful, sensing that even small things could trigger royal displeasure. which could have consequences extending far beyond that single dinner. Living under this kind of constant observation, where your worth was measured by performance rather than authenticity, created a strange kind of loneliness, even while surrounded by hundreds of people every single day and night. Many courtiers privately admitted, in letters that survive to this day, that they felt isolated despite the constant crowds, because true friendships were rare in an environment where everyone was potentially a rival, and even close relationships could be used as leverage in the endless games of influence that defined daily life at Versailles. This is part of why historians often describe the palace as a gilded cage, a place of incredible beauty and luxury on the surface, but one that trapped its inhabitants in a never-ending cycle of performance, anxiety and exhaustion. For the king, things were arguably even more intense, since Louis XIV in particular used the rituals of dining and daily life as political tools, deliberately designing this system to keep nobles distracted, competing with each other for small honours and privileges rather than uniting against royal authority by turning everyday activities like dressing, eating, and even using the chamber pot into ceremonies with assigned roles. He made access to his person a form of currency, and nobles spent fortunes and years of effort simply trying to gain small privileges, like holding his candle or handing him a napkin, privileges that meant nothing practically but everything socially. This system was so effective that it shaped the entire culture of Versailles for generations, even after Louis XIV died, with his successors inheriting both the palace and the exhausting traditions that came with it. By the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, some of these rigid customs had begun to soften slightly, with smaller, more private dinners becoming more common among certain circles. Yet the grand formal dinners and public dining rituals still persisted, for major occasions, continuing to overwhelm anyone unfamiliar with court life. Visitors who managed to survive a full Versailles dinner without major missteps often described feeling a strange mixture of relief and pride, as though they had passed some unspoken test, even if no one ever officially acknowledged it. And for those who failed, even in small ways, the consequences could follow them for the rest of their time at court, becoming part of their reputation whether they liked it or not. Looking back now from the comfort of our own homes, free from corsets, candle smoke, and centuries-old etiquette books, it's almost hard to imagine living under such constant pressure simply to eat a meal. Yet for thousands of people who lived at Versailles, this was simply normal life, repeated night after night, year after year, a world where elegance and exhaustion existed side by side, hidden behind golden walls and flickering candlelight. Beyond the nobles themselves, an entire invisible workforce made this elaborate world function, and their experiences offer another layer to this story. Hundreds of servants, cooks, and attendants worked behind the scenes, often labouring in cramped, poorly ventilated kitchens located surprisingly far from the dining halls, meaning food had to travel long distances through cold corridors before reaching the table, which explains why so many dishes arrived less than ideal despite the enormous effort put into preparing them. These kitchen workers operated under their own strict hierarchy, with master chefs commanding small armies of assistants. each responsible for a specific task, from roasting meat to preparing delicate pastries, and mistakes in this chain could result in harsh punishment or dismissal, since failing to please the royal table was taken extremely seriously. Interestingly, despite the palace's image of endless abundance, there were times when supplies ran short, especially during difficult years for the French economy. Yet appearances had to be maintained regardless, meaning kitchens sometimes resorted to clever substitutions or smaller portions disguised through elaborate presentation, all so that guests would never suspect anything was amiss. The pressure on these workers was immense, knowing that a single delayed dish or slightly overcooked course could result in royal displeasure rippling down through the entire household staff. Meanwhile, outside the dining halls, the gardens of Versailles, often imagined as peaceful retreats, were sometimes used by guests desperate for a moment of genuine relaxation away from the suffocating formality indoors, though even there, one had to remain mindful of who might be watching from windows or strolling nearby. Some courtiers wrote about sneaking away during long dinners, claiming they needed fresh air, just to escape the noise and pressure, for a few precious minutes before returning to their assigned seats and resuming the performance. Letters and diaries from this era reveal a recurring theme: exhaustion disguised as elegance, with many writers admitting they dreaded certain formal dinners weeks in advance, mentally preparing themselves the way someone today might prepare for an important exam or interview. Even small children of noble families sometimes attended shortened versions of these events as part of their education, learning early that survival at court depended less on personal comfort and more on perfect, unwavering presentation, a lesson that would shape their entire lives within these golden, candlelit, but quietly merciless halls. One particularly telling story involves a foreign ambassador who, upon his first visit to Versailles, made the mistake of admiring a piece of furniture a little too openly, commenting on its beauty to a nearby courtier. Within hours, word spread that he had been begging for gifts, a rumour that embarrassed him for the remainder of his stay, despite his attempts to clarify that he meant nothing more than polite admiration. This single misunderstanding followed him into diplomatic meetings, subtly affecting how seriously other nobles took his requests, illustrating just how quickly words could be twisted within these walls. Another account describes a young noblewoman who fainted during a particularly long formal dinner, not from illness, but simply from the combined effects of a tightly laced corset and hours of standing in heavy ceremonial dress. Rather than receiving sympathy, she became the subject of quiet ridicule for weeks afterward, with whispers suggesting she lacked the stamina expected of someone in her position. A harsh judgment that reveals how little tolerance existed for any sign of human weakness in this environment. Even Louis XIV himself, despite being the most powerful man in the room, wasn't entirely free from these pressures, since his every meal was scrutinized by foreign diplomats looking for signs of his health, mood, or political intentions, meaning even the king had to perform a version of strength and composure, regardless of how he actually felt. There's also a curious detail historians often mention: the practice of tasting food before it reached the king originally meant to prevent poisoning, which added yet another layer of ceremony, delay and tension to every single dish served, turning what should have been a simple meal into a slow, cautious process involving multiple people before a single bite ever touched royal lips. As the decades passed and the financial strain on France grew heavier, particularly under Louis XVI, these extravagant displays began to feel increasingly disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people outside the palace walls, a gap that would eventually contribute to growing resentment and unrest. Yet even as criticism mounted, the rituals continued largely unchanged, partly because no one within the system had the power or the courage to dismantle traditions so deeply woven into the identity of Versailles itself. Traditions that had defined generations and shaped an entire culture around the simple, universal act of sharing a meal. By the 1780s, the contrast between life inside Versailles and life outside its gates had become impossible to ignore. While courtiers continued their elaborate dinners, often unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the severity of the situation, ordinary citizens in Paris and across the French countryside faced rising bread prices, poor harvests and genuine hunger. Stories began circulating among the public about the sheer scale of royal meals, the dozens of courses, the gold tableware, the army of servants required just to serve a single dinner. And these stories, whether exaggerated or not, fueled growing anger toward a monarchy that seemed completely detached from the suffering of its people. Marie Antoinette, in particular, became a target of public resentment, with rumours about her spending habits spreading rapidly, some accurate, others wildly distorted, yet all of them reinforcing an image of a royal court obsessed with luxury. While the nation struggled inside the palace, however, daily life continued much as it always had, with formal dinners still following centuries-old customs, as if the rituals themselves provided a sense of stability in increasingly uncertain times. Some historians suggest that for many nobles, clinging to these traditions wasn't simply about vanity, but about identity, since an entire way of life, their sense of purpose, status, and belonging was built around these rituals, and abandoning them would have meant acknowledging that their world was changing in ways they couldn't control. When the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789, the very symbols that once represented power and refinement, the gold dishes, the endless courses, the rigid etiquette, became evidence used against the monarchy, proof of a system that prioritized appearance over substance, ceremony over compassion. The grand dining halls that once hosted nightly performances of elegance fell silent, the candles extinguished, the silver platters seized, and the elaborate rituals that had governed daily life for generations simply ceased to exist almost overnight. Today, when visitors walk through the restored halls of Versailles, admiring the gold ceilings and grand mirrors, it's easy to forget the human stories hidden within those walls. The exhaustion, the anxiety, the quiet desperation of people trying to survive within a system that demanded perfection at every single meal. What once seemed like the height of glamour was, for many who lived it, simply another night of careful performance. Another night where survival depended not on comfort or happiness, but on never letting the mask slip, even for a moment, beneath the warm, flickering candle light of Versailles. Interestingly, Versailles wasn't entirely unique in this regard, though it certainly became the most extreme example for other European courts to study and imitate. Rulers across the continent, from Austria to Russia, sent representatives to observe French court life, specifically so they could replicate certain elements back home, believing that elaborate ceremony was a visible sign of power and legitimacy. This meant that variations of these exhausting dining rituals spread throughout royal households across Europe, each court adapting them slightly while keeping the same underlying philosophy. That visibility, performance, and hierarchy mattered more than personal comfort. In some cours these come even more rigid over time, with strict rules about who could be seated near a window, who could wear certain colours, or who was permitted to remain standing versus sitting during a meal. All small details that carried enormous symbolic weight for those living within these systems. What's fascinating is how long these traditions persisted in various forms, with echoes of formal court dining, etiquette surviving well into the 19th century in some European monarchies, long after Versailles itself had ceased to be the centre of royal power. Diplomats trained in these customs sometimes found themselves navigating multiple court systems throughout their careers, each with slightly different unwritten rules, meaning a single misstep could create confusion or offence even among people who considered themselves experienced in formal etiquette. For modern readers, it can be tempting to view all of this as simply absurd, a strange historical curiosity disconnected from anything relevant today. Yet in many ways, the underlying dynamics, the pressure to perform, the fear of judgment, the careful management of appearances in social settings still resonate, even if our modern versions look very different on the surface. Perhaps that's part of why stories about Versailles continue to fascinate people centuries later, not just because of the gold and grandeur, but because beneath all that glittering excess was something deeply human. People trying their best to navigate complicated social expectations, often at great personal cost, within a world they didn't fully choose for themselves. And so, as the candles of Versailles flicker now only in our imagination, we close this chapter of history, drifting away from the grand halls and endless courses, leaving behind the whispers and watchful eyes, settling instead into the quiet, comfortable darkness of sleep. Let's drift further back in time now, to understand how this strange world came to exist in the first place, beginning with the construction of Versailles itself. Originally, the site was nothing more than a modest hunting lodge surrounded by marshland, a quiet retreat where Louis XIII occasionally escaped the pressures of Paris, but his son, Louis XIV, saw something far greater in this unremarkable piece of land, an opportunity to build not just a palace, but a symbol of absolute power so overwhelming that no one could ever question his authority again. Construction began in the 1660s and continued for decades, employing tens of thousands of workers at various points, many of them labouring under harsh conditions, draining swamps, moving entire forests of mature trees to create instant gardens, and diverting rivers to feed the elaborate fountain systems that would become famous throughout Europe. The human cost of this project was staggering, with disease spreading through worker camps due to the marshy terrain. And historical records suggest that many labourers died during construction, their deaths largely unrecorded and unmarked, swallowed up by the scale of the undertaking. Yet from this difficult beginning emerged something unprecedented. A palace covering hundreds of acres, with thousands of rooms, miles of gardens, and fountains so elaborate that engineers struggled for years to make the water systems function properly, since the technology required to pump water uphill across such distances simply didn't exist yet in reliable form. Louis XIV's Seconde Vision wasn't imi baut strategic. By moving the entire royal court from Paris to Versailles in 1682, he effectively removed the nobility from their traditional power bases, their family estates, their local influence, their independent networks, forcing them instead into a controlled environment where every aspect of daily life revolved around proximity to the king. This relocation fundamentally restructured French politics, transforming the nobility from semi-independent regional powers into courtiers, entirely dependent on royal favour for advancement, wealth and social standing. Once settled at Versailles, nobles found themselves competing not for control over their own territories, but for symbolic privileges within the palace itself. A deliberate shift that kept potential rivals distracted and divided. Louis XIV himself became known as the Sun King, a title that wasn't merely poetic flattery but central to how he positioned himself within the court's daily rhythms, just as the sun rises and sets, structuring the natural world, the king's own schedule, his waking, dressing, dining, and sleeping became the structure around which the entire palace revolved. His morning ritual, known as the levee, involved dozens of nobles attending his waking and dressing, each assigned specific tasks based on rank, handing him his shirt, his shoes, his wig, with the most senior nobles receiving the honour of the most intimate tasks. To an outsider seemed bizarre, grown adults competing for the privilege of handing a grown man his socks. Yet within the logic of Versailles, these moments represented direct access to royal favour, opportunities to whisper a request, build a relationship, or simply be seen standing close to power, all of which could translate into real political and financial advantages later. This same logic extended to bedtime as well. Vice-King's evening routine, known as the Kur, following similarly elaborate protocols, meaning Louis XIV was rarely, if ever, truly alone. His entire existence unfolding as a continuous public performance from the moment he opened his eyes until the moment he closed them again. Some historians argue that this constant visibility, while exhausting, also served as a form of protection, since a king who was never alone was also a king who was difficult to assassinate or manipulate in private, surrounded as he always was by witnesses. The palace itself was designed with this performative lifestyle in mind, featuring long galleries meant for processions, grand staircases designed for dramatic entrances, and the famous Hall of Mirrors, a corridor lined with 17 enormous mirrors, reflecting light from matching windows, creating an almost otherworldly glow during evening receptions, where hundreds of candles multiplied infinitely in the reflective surfaces, producing an effect so dazzling that visitors often described feeling disoriented. as though stepping into another world entirely upon entering. This deliberate engineering of awe, using architecture, light, and ritual together, helped reinforce the idea that the king existed on a different plane from ordinary mortals, an idea that shaped how every single interaction within these walls, including dinner itself, was structured and understood by everyone present, regardless of their actual rank or background. As the years passed and Louis XIV grew older, the rigid systems he had created took on a life of their own, becoming so deeply embedded in court culture that even the king himself sometimes found them burdensome, yet impossible to abandon without seeming weak. By the later decades of his reign, observers noted a strange paradox. The most powerful man in Europe was also, in many ways, a prisoner of the very ceremonies designed to display his power, unable to eat a private meal, take a quiet walk, or even grieve personal losses without an audience watching his every reaction. When his son and grandson died within a short span of each other, leaving his young great-grandson as heir, Louis XIV reportedly had to maintain composure during formal court functions, even while privately devastated, because any visible weakness could be interpreted as instability at the highest levels of government, potentially encouraging foreign rivals or ambitious nobles to act. This pressure to separate personal emotion from public performance became, in many ways, the defining skill required to survive at Versailles, not just for the king, but for everyone within his orbit. When Louis XIV finally died in 1715, after a reign lasting over 70 years, the system he built didn't disappear. Instead, it simply continued under new management. First under a regency for his young successor, and later under Louis XV himself, who inherited not just a palace, but an entire culture of performance that had become, by this point, simply how French royalty operated. Interestingly, Louis XV, despite ruling for nearly 60 years, often seemed personally uncomfortable with certain aspects of this lifestyle, reportedly preferring smaller, more private gatherings whenever possible. A creation of intimate dining rooms, tucked away from the grand ceremonial halls, spaces where a slightly more relaxed atmosphere could exist, though even these private spaces had their own unspoken rules about who could be invited and what behaviour was acceptable. This tension between the inherited expectations of grand ceremony and a genuine human desire for normalcy would continue shaping life at Versailles right up until its final years as the seat of French monarchy. By the time Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, alongside his young wife Marie Antoinette, Versailles had existed as the centre of French royal life for nearly a century, and the weight of all those accumulated traditions had only grown heavier. Louis XVI, by most accounts, was a reserved and somewhat awkward young man, more interested in mechanics, locksmithing, and quiet pursuits than in the elaborate social performances expected of him. Yet he had little choice but to step into a role that demanded constant visibility and ceremony. Marie Antoinette found the rigid French court customs particularly stifling. Having grown up in a household with comparatively more relaxed family dynamics, she reportedly struggled with the formal dressing ceremonies, where attendance of specific Ranks were required to hand her items of clothing in a precise order, sometimes resulting in awkward delays if the correct ranking attendant wasn't present, leaving the Queen standing partially dressed while servants sorted out questions of protocol. Frustrated by these constraints, Marie Antoinette began retreating more frequently to the Petit Trianon, a smaller chateau within the Versailles grounds that had been gifted to her, where she could escape some of the most rigid formalities and surround herself with a smaller circle of close friends. While this brought her personal relief, it also fueled public criticism, since spending time away from the main palace and its traditional ceremonies was seen by many traditional courtiers as a rejection of duty, reinforcing the Queen's image as frivolous and disconnected from her responsibilities. Meanwhile, formal state dinners continued at the main palace, often for visiting dignitaries or major celebrations, and these events remained as elaborate as ever, sometimes even more so, as France attempted to project an image of stability and grandeur, even as financial pressures mounted behind the scenes. Foreign visitors during this period often left detailed accounts of these dinners, describing not just the food and decoration, but the exhausting choreography required simply to attend, the hours of preparation, the specific order of arrivals, the careful seating arrangements that could take diplomats weeks to negotiate in advance. Since seating position at a state dinner could be interpreted as a political statement about relationships between nations, even something as simple as which door a foreign ambassador entered through carried symbolic weight, with more prestigious doors reserved for representatives of more important nations, meaning ambassadors sometimes spent considerable energy simply lobbying for better entrance routes before a dinner had even begun. This obsession with symbolism extended to every visible detail: the placement of candles, the choice of tablecloths, the specific flowers used in arrangements, all carefully considered and often debated among palace staff for days before major events, since any perceived oversight could be read as a deliberate insult by visiting dignitaries who were themselves trained to notice such things. Within this increasingly tense atmosphere, where genuine financial crisis simmered beneath layers of ceremonial perfection, the dinners of Versailles continued much as they always had: beautiful, exhausting, and increasingly disconnected from the world outside its gates. A final glittering performance before the curtain would eventually fall on this entire way of life. Let's take a closer look now at what actually appeared on the table during these legendary dinners, because the sheer variety and excess involved is almost difficult to comprehend by modern standards. A formal dinner might begin with multiple soups served simultaneously, followed by an enormous selection of meats, often including several types of poultry, beef, veal, and game such as pheasant or venison, each prepared using elaborate techniques and presented with decorative garnishes meant to impress visually as much as satisfy hunger. Fish courses followed, frequently transported from distant coastal regions using methods that, despite best efforts, couldn't always guarantee freshness by the time the dish reached Versailles, though chefs became remarkably skilled at using strong sauces and seasonings to mask any unwanted flavours that resulted from these long journeys. Vegetables, somewhat surprisingly, played a smaller role in these meals compared to today's standards, often appearing more as decorative elements or palate cleansers between heavier courses rather than substantial dishes in their own right, reflecting period beliefs about nutrition that prioritised meat as a marker of wealth and status. Desserts represented perhaps the most extravagant displays of all, with elaborate sugar sculptures sometimes built to resemble entire architectural scenes, miniature gardens, or mythological figures, requiring specialised pastry chefs who trained for years to master these techniques. These sugar creations were so elaborate that some were displayed purely for visual effect and never actually eaten, existing solely to demonstrate the wealth and artistic capability available to the royal household. Behind all of this, an enormous support system operated continuously, including specialised roles like the official royal taster, whose job involved sampling dishes before they reached the king, not just for poison detection as commonly believed, but also to ensure proper temperature, seasoning and quality, meaning this person effectively ate a small version of every meal before anyone else did. The kitchens themselves were architectural marvels in their own right, though largely hidden from the eyes of guests who only ever saw the finished results. Versailles featured multiple kitchen complexes, separated by function, with some dedicated entirely to roasting meats over massive open fires. Others focused on delicate pastry work requiring more controlled temperatures, and still others handling the constant production of sauces, which French cuisine of this era relied upon heavily to add flavour, colour and visual appeal to dishes, coordinating between these different kitchen areas required an almost military level of organisation, since dozens of separate dishes needed to arrive at the dining hall at roughly the same time, despite being prepared in completely different locations, sometimes considerable distances apart within the sprawling palace complex. Head chefs held positions of surprising influence, often interacting directly with palace administrators to plan menus weeks in advance, taking into account seasonal availability, upcoming celebrations, dietary preferences of important guests, and even subtle political considerations, since serving a dish associated with a particular region or country could send diplomatic signals during state visits. Beneath these head chefs worked armies of specialised cooks, each trained in narrow areas of expertise, some focusing exclusively on sauces, others on specific types of meat preparation, and still others dedicated entirely to ice creams and frozen desserts, which required complex techniques involving ice harvested during winter and stored in specially insulated underground chambers throughout the year. The physical demands on kitchen staff were immense, working in hot, smoky environments for hours at a time, often starting preparations long before dawn to ensure everything would be ready for meals that might not occur until late evening. Burns, cuts, and exhaustion were common occupational hazards, yet kitchen positions were also highly sought after, since working within the royal household, even in a lower position, provided a level of stability, food access, and social connection unavailable to most people outside the palace walls. Some kitchen workers eventually used their experience and connections gained at Versailles to open their own establishments in Paris, contributing to the eventual rise of restaurant culture in France during the following century, meaning the legacy of these exhausting royal kitchens extended far beyond Palace itself, influencing culinary traditions that continue shaping French cuisine and its global reputation even now, centuries after the elaborate dinners of Versailles finally came to an end. Music and entertainment played a surprisingly central role in shaping the atmosphere of these dinners, transforming what might otherwise have felt like a tense, silent ordeal into something resembling a continuous performance for all the senses. Court composers were employed specifically to create pieces suitable for background listening during meals, music designed not to dominate attention but to fill silences, smooth over awkward pauses in conversation, and reinforce the overall sense of refined sophistication that Versailles worked so hard to project. Small ensembles of musicians, often positioned in galleries or alcoves slightly removed from the main dining area, played continuously throughout lengthy meals, their music shifting subtly depending on the formality of the occasion, more restrained and elegant for everyday dinners, more elaborate and celebratory for major state events. Some of Secunde's most renowned composers spent time composing for or performing within these environments, their work shaped directly by the practical needs of court life, music that needed to be pleasant without being distracting, impressive without overshadowing the king himself, since drawing too much attention away from the monarch, even through art, could be seen as inappropriate. Beyond music, dinners sometimes incorporated other forms of entertainment as well, particularly during major celebrations, including brief theatrical performances, poetry readings, or even small displays, involving exotic animals brought from distant parts of the world, gifts from foreign rulers that were sometimes paraded through dining halls as living symbols of France's global influence and connections. These animal displays, while fascinating to guests, also created unexpected complications, since maintaining exotic creatures within a palace environment proved logistically challenging, and there are accounts of minor chaos erupting when animals reacted unpredictably to the noise, lights, and crowds of a formal dinner, moments that, despite being technically embarrassing, sometimes became cherished stories, retold for years afterward among those who witnessed them firsthand. Dancing also followed many formal dinners, particularly during evening celebrations, with specific dances reserved for specific social occasions, and knowing these dances wasn't optional, since failing to participate appropriately when invited could be seen as either rudeness or incompetence, adding yet another skill to the long list of things courtiers needed to master simply to navigate daily life successfully. Even something as seemingly light-hearted as dancing carried weight, with partner selection sometimes reflecting political alliances or romantic interests that observant courtiers would analyse and discuss for days afterward, proving once again that at Versailles absolutely nothing, no matter how small or seemingly casual, existed purely for enjoyment alone. Everything carried meaning, everything was watched, and everything became part of the larger story, being constantly written and rewritten through the daily lives of those who called this extraordinary, exhausting palace home. Beyond the indoor dining halls, some of the most spectacular dining experiences at Versailles actually took place outdoors, during elaborate garden parties known as fêtes, events that combined dining, music, theatre, and stunning visual displays across the palace's vast gardens. These outdoor celebrations often unfolded across multiple locations throughout the grounds, with guests moving from one area to another over the course of an evening, encountering different entertainments, refreshments, and surprises along carefully planned routes designed to maximise wonder and astonishment at every turn. Temporary structures, sometimes remarkably elaborate despite being built for a single night, were constructed specifically for these events, including pavilions decorated with thousands of flowers, fabric draped in ways that created entire artificial rooms within the gardens themselves, and lighting arrangements using countless candles and lanterns that transformed the grounds into something resembling a fantasy landscape after dark. Fountains, which Versailles was already famous for, became central features during these celebrations, with water displays choreographed alongside music, sometimes synchronized, so precisely that fountains would burst into motion at specific musical cues, creating effects that left even experienced courtiers genuinely amazed. Despite their general tendency toward studied indifference in most situations, food service during these outdoor events presented unique logistical challenges, since maintaining proper temperatures, presentation, and timing across such large, spread out spaces required even more coordination than indoor dinners, with staff stationed at multiple points throughout the gardens, ready to serve guests as they moved through different areas, ensuring that no matter where someone happened to be standing, refreshments would be available within moments. Fireworks displays often concluded these evenings with elaborate pyrotechnic shows designed by specialists who travelled from various parts of Europe, since this expertise was relatively rare and highly valued. These shows sometimes incorporating images or symbols related to the specific celebration being honoured, whether a royal birth, a military victory, or a diplomatic alliance. For guests fortunate enough to attend these grand fêtes, the experience could feel almost overwhelming in its sensory richness, yet even eerie amid seemingly boundless beauty and celebration. The same underlying rules of observation and judgment remained firmly in place, with every reaction, every expression of delight or boredom, still being quietly noted by those around them, proving that, even in the most magical settings imaginable, the performance of court life never truly paused, not even for a single moment, regardless of how dazzling the surrounding spectacle might be. In the years following the Revolution, Versailles stood largely empty and silent, its once bustling halls stripped of furniture, its kitchens cold, its gardens overgrown in places where they had once been meticulously maintained by armies of gardeners working in shifts around the clock. The palace narrowly avoided complete destruction during the most chaotic, revolutionary years, surviving instead through a strange combination of neglect and occasional preservation, efforts by individuals who recognised its historical significance even amid widespread anger toward everything it represented. Much of what we know today about daily life and dining customs at Versailles comes from an unexpectedly rich collection of personal writings, letters between courtiers, diaries kept by servants, and memoirs written by foreign ambassadors who documented their experiences in remarkable detail, sometimes specifically because they found the customs so strange compared to their own countries that they felt compelled to record them for friends and family back home. These documents reveal small, human details that formal histories often miss. Complaints about cold food, descriptions of uncomfortable shoes, frustrations with confusing seating charts, and even occasional moments of genuine humour. Courtiers privately mocking certain rituals even while participating in them with apparent seriousness, suggesting that beneath the rigid exterior, people remained people, finding small ways to cope with absurdity through shared private jokes and knowing glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Some servants who worked at Versailles during its final years, before the revolution, later gave accounts describing the strange atmosphere of those last formal dinners, a sense that something was shifting, though few could have predicted just how completely this world would disappear within just a few short years, after decades of restoration efforts, beginning in earnest during the 19th century and continuing in various forms ever since. Versailles eventually reopened to the public, transforming from a private royal residence into one of the most visited historical sites in the world, allowing millions of people to walk through halls that once hosted these extraordinary, exhausting dinners. But before we leave Versailles entirely, there is one final detail worth considering as we settle deeper into the quiet rhythms of the past. For all the dazzling displays of wealth, gold, and ceremony, the people who attended these dinners were often surprisingly uncomfortable. Modern visitors tend to imagine that nobles lived in constant luxury, surrounded by every convenience imaginable. Yet many courtiers spent their days exhausted from endless social obligations that began early in the morning and stretched late into the night. A noble invited to dine at Versailles might spend hours preparing for a single meal. Clothing alone could take an extraordinary amount of time. Layers of fabric, carefully arranged wigs, cosmetics, jewellery, and accessories all had to be perfectly positioned. A small mistake in appearance could become the subject of gossip for weeks. Even sitting comfortably was not always easy. Heavy clothing restricted movement. Tight shoes caused pain. Elaborate hairstyles sometimes required sleeping in awkward positions to preserve their shape for the next day. What appears glamorous in portraits often concealed significant discomfort. The food itself could be magnificent, but quantity did not always guarantee satisfaction. Dishes arrived according to strict ceremonial patterns, and not every guest had equal access to the best selections. Status determined proximity too. Important tables and influenced what a person could reasonably expect to eat. Some attendees left grand feasts, surprisingly hungry despite being surrounded by mountains of food. The servants who made these meals possible lived in a completely different world. Long before dawn, Kitchen staff were already at work preparing ingredients, tending fires, transporting supplies, and coordinating hundreds of tasks that had to occur with remarkable precision. Their labour remained largely invisible to the nobles they served, yet the entire spectacle depended upon them. Perhaps this contrast is one of the most revealing aspects of Versailles. Behind every glittering banquet stood countless workers, whose names history rarely recorded. Behind every polished silver tray stood someone carrying it. Behind every magnificent hall stood people cleaning, repairing, organising, and maintaining it. And so, as the candles burn lower and the sounds of conversation finally fade into silence, we remember not only the kings and queens, but also the cooks, gardeners, servants, and ordinary workers who quietly kept this extraordinary world functioning day after day. The palace sleeps now. The tables have been cleared. The guests have gone home. The music has ended. Only the echoes remain. And with those echoes gently fading into the distance, we can finally leave Versailles behind and allow ourselves to drift peacefully into a well-earned sleep. The palace itself seemed to understand this rhythm of endless preparation and performance long before the first guests entered the dining halls. Hundreds of workers were already moving through corridors, illuminated only by candlelight. Bakers kneaded dough while much of the court still slept. Kitchen boys carried buckets of water across stone floors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Firekeepers tended enormous hearths that consumed vast quantities of wood every single day. The smell of smoke, roasting meat, fresh bread, and melted wax drifted through hidden passageways rarely seen by the nobles who would later enjoy the finished results. For many servants, the most stressful moments came not during the preparation but during the meal itself. A dropped plate, a spilled drink, or a forgotten instruction could result in harsh punishment or the loss of a position that had taken years to obtain. Every movement had to appear effortless, even when carrying heavy silver trays through crowded rooms filled with important guests. Servants learned to become nearly invisible, present everywhere yet noticed nowhere, a skill that required remarkable discipline and patience. Foreign visitors often wrote about this strange atmosphere. Some were deeply impressed by the scale of everything they witnessed. Others found it exhausting. Ambassadors arriving from distant kingdoms sometimes spent weeks learning court customs simply to avoid embarrassing mistakes. Something as simple as standing in the wrong place or speaking to the wrong person before a meal could create awkward situations that lingered for months. Many visitors privately admitted in letters that they felt relieved whenever they finally left Versailles and returned home. Yet despite all its difficulties, people continued to dream of receiving invitations. The palace remained the centre of power, and a single successful dinner could change a person's future. Friendships were formed over shared meals. Political alliances emerged during quiet conversations between courses. Careers rose and fell based on impressions made while seated at a crowded table beneath glittering chandeliers. To eat at Versailles was not merely to have dinner. It was to participate in a carefully choreographed performance where every gesture carried meaning. As evening progressed and the final courses disappeared from the tables. Guests rarely enjoyed immediate rest. Conversations continued in salons and galleries. Musicians performed. Courtiers exchanged news and rumours. Some individuals remained awake well past midnight, only to begin the entire cycle again the following morning. Sleep itself often became a luxury in a world where appearance and ambition demanded constant attention. Perhaps that is what surprises modern people most about life at Versailles. Behind all the beauty stood an endless struggle to maintain appearances. Beneath the gold decorations, embroidered clothing, and magnificent feasts were ordinary human beings dealing with fatigue, anxiety, ambition, and uncertainty. Much like people today, the surroundings were extraordinary, but the emotions remained familiar. And as the palace grows quieter around us, we can almost imagine those final candles flickering along distant corridors, their light dancing softly against stone walls before slowly fading into darkness. The kitchens fall silent. The footsteps disappear. Another day at Versailles comes gently to an end. Not everyone at Versailles experienced the palace in the same way. While nobles worried about reputation and status, servants often worried about something much simpler, making it through another demanding day without mistakes. The contrast between these two worlds existed side by side, separated by only a few walls and corridors. A duke might spend an hour deciding where to sit at dinner, while a kitchen worker spent that same hour hauling sacks of flour or chopping vegetables for hundreds of guests. The palace required an astonishing amount of food. Historians estimate that enormous quantities of meat, fish, bread, fruit, wine, and spices entered Versailles every week. Supply wagons arrived constantly, bringing goods from nearby farms and distant regions. Fresh seafood sometimes travelled 4 days. Exotic fruits appeared on tables despite being difficult and expensive to obtain. Maintaining such abundance required a network of merchants, farmers, cooks, and labourers working together long before modern transportation existed. Guests often judged a dinner not only by the quality of the food, but by the spectacle surrounding it. The presentation mattered almost as much as the meal itself. Elaborate serving dishes made of silver reflected candlelight across the room. Decorative centerpieces displayed wealth and artistic skill. Some dishes were arranged to resemble gardens, castles, or mythical scenes. The goal was not merely to feed people but to impress them, reminding everyone present of the king's immense power and resources. Yet behind these displays lurked constant practical challenges. Candles produced smoke. Crowded rooms became warm and stuffy. Heavy clothing trapped heat. During summer months, some dining halls could become surprisingly uncomfortable. Guests smiled politely while secretly wishing for fresh air. Letters from the period occasionally mention headaches, fatigue, and the difficulty of remaining cheerful through long ceremonies. Children raised at court learned these customs from an early age. Young nobles were expected to understand rules of etiquette long before adulthood. They observed formal dinners, memorized proper behaviour, and practiced the social skills necessary to survive court life. A careless child could embarrass an entire family. As a result, even childhood at Versailles often involved expectations that modern people might find exhausting. Perhaps the strangest aspect of all was how normal it seemed to those living there. People adapt quickly to their surroundings. Customs that appear bizarre centuries later once felt completely ordinary. Courtiers accepted rituals because they had grown up with them. Servants followed routines because they knew no alternative. The extraordinary gradually became familiar, and so the great machine of Versailles continued turning day after day, meal after meal, year after year. Few people could imagine that this powerful world, which seemed so permanent and unshakable, was quietly moving toward a future none of them could fully see. The candles still burned brightly, the music still played, and the dining halls remained full. But history, patient and unstoppable, was already approaching from beyond the palace gates. Outside the glittering halls of Versailles, however, France was changing. While nobles attended elaborate dinners and debated matters of etiquette, many ordinary people faced a far different reality. Poor harvests, rising food prices, and growing frustration created tensions that could not remain hidden forever. News travelled slowly compared to modern times. But even within the palace walls, whispers of unrest occasionally reached the ears of courtiers. At first, many members of the court dismissed these concerns. Versailles had existed for generations as the centre of royal power. Its grand halls, magnificent gardens, and endless ceremonies seemed to symbolise stability itself. To those living there, it was difficult to imagine a future in which this world might disappear. The palace appeared eternal, yet history often changes in ways that seem impossible until they suddenly become unavoidable. Some observers later recalled a growing sense of uncertainty during the final years before the revolution. Conversations became more cautious. Political disagreements grew sharper. Certain guests who once attended lavish dinners regularly began appearing less frequently. Others spoke quietly about financial problems facing the kingdom. Most people continued their routines. But beneath the surface, anxiety slowly spread. Still, each evening the candles were lit. Servants prepared the tables. Musicians tuned their instruments. Guests arrived in elegant clothing and followed the familiar rituals they had practiced for years. The machinery of court life continued to operate, even as the foundations beneath it began to weaken. There is something deeply human about this. People rarely recognize the end of an era while they are living through it. Ordinary days continue. Meals are served. Conversations take place. Tomorrow seems likely to resemble yesterday. Only later, looking back, do the signs become clear. The courtiers gathered around those magnificent tables could not know that future. Generations would study their world with fascination. They could not know that the palace would one day become a museum rather than a royal home. They simply lived their lives, navigating the customs, challenges, and expectations of their time. And so, for one more evening, the dining halls of Versailles glow with candlelight. Laughter drifts softly through the air. Silver dishes shine upon the tables. Beyond the windows, darkness settles gently over the gardens, while the palace continues its nightly performance, unaware that history is quietly drawing nearer with every passing year. As the years passed, the distance between Versailles and the rest of France seemed to grow wider. Inside the palace, life continued according to schedules that had changed little over decades. Ceremonies began at precise times. Meals followed familiar patterns. Courtiers competed for attention and favour, just as their parents and grandparents had done before them. Outside, however, many families worried about the price of bread. For ordinary people, food was not part of an elaborate performance. It was a daily necessity. A poor harvest could mean real hardship. A rise in prices could force difficult choices. While nobles discussed etiquette, countless citizens focused on simply feeding their households. Not every courtier was blind to these realities. Some recognized that problems were growing. A few warned that reforms were necessary. Yet large institutions often move slowly, especially when those benefiting from the system have little incentive to change it. Versailles remained magnificent, but magnificence alone could not solve the challenges facing the kingdom. Meanwhile, the palace itself required constant maintenance. Roofs needed repairs. Gardens demanded endless care. Fountains consumed enormous amounts of water and labour. Every polished floor, trimmed hedge, and sparkling chandelier represented hours of work performed by people whose names rarely appeared in official records. Visitors continued to arrive from across Europe, marvelling at what they saw. Even critics often admitted that Versailles was unlike anything else in the world. The scale was overwhelming. The architecture inspired admiration. The dinners remained famous for their luxury and complexity. Yet, beneath the admiration, some visitors sensed that the palace represented a world increasingly out of step with changing times. Still, on countless evenings, none of this seemed urgent. Guests gathered beneath glittering chandeliers. Music echoed softly through vast rooms. Wine was poured. Conversations drifted from politics to fashion, from gossip to personal ambitions. For a few hours, the outside world felt very far away. And perhaps that is why the story of Versailles remains so fascinating. It was both extraordinary and fragile. It appeared powerful beyond measure. Yet it depended on conditions that could not last forever. Like a candle burning brightly in a dark room, its brilliance was undeniable. But every candle, no matter how bright, eventually reaches the end of its flame. Yet, even as the flame began to shorten, those living inside Versailles could not easily see it. Human beings are remarkably skilled at believing that the present will continue indefinitely. The grand dinners kept taking place. Invitations were still coveted. Courtiers still hurried through polished corridors, hoping to secure a better position, a stronger alliance, or a brief moment of royal attention. For many nobles, the palace had become more than a residence. It was an entire universe with its own rules, traditions, and expectations. Success at Versailles required mastering countless details. One had to know whom to greet first, and when to speak, and sometimes even how deeply to bow. These customs could seem exhausting to outsiders, but to those raised within the system, they felt natural. Meanwhile, younger generations entered court life, carrying the same ambitions that had motivated their parents. They dreamed of influence, prestige, and recognition. Few stopped to question whether the world around them would always remain the same. Why would they? The palace had stood for decades as the symbol of royal authority. Its marble floors, golden decorations, and endless ceremonies projected an image of permanence. But history often moves quietly before it moves suddenly. Small signs of change appeared here and there. Conversations about money became more frequent. Political debates grew more intense. News arriving from Paris sometimes carried an uneasy tone. What had once seemed like distant concerns slowly felt closer. Still, Daily life continued. Dinner tables were set. Candles were lit. Musicians played their familiar melodies. There is a certain sadness in knowing what the people of Versailles could not know. We understand how the story ends. We know that many traditions they considered eternal would soon vanish. We know that some of the magnificent rooms filled with conversation would one day fall silent. Yet perhaps that is why these old accounts remain so moving. They preserve ordinary moments from a world standing unknowingly at the edge of transformation. A servant carrying a tray, a guest adjusting a wig, friends sharing a quiet joke across a crowded table. Tiny moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but survived in letters and diaries long after the grand events had passed. And so, for one more evening, the palace shines against the darkness, brilliant and confident, while beyond its walls the future continues its slow, steady approach. The approaching changes did not arrive all at once. There was no single evening when the chandeliers suddenly went dark and everyone realized the old world was ending. Instead, the transformation unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Rumours spread through corridors. Letters carried troubling news from Paris discussions that once focused on fashion. Marriages and court appointments increasingly turned toward finances, politics and public unrest. Some courtiers responded by ignoring these developments altogether. They continued attending dinners, hosting gatherings, and following familiar routines. Others became nervous, sensing that the stability they had always taken for granted might not be as permanent as it seemed. Human nature rarely changes. Faced with uncertainty, some people deny it, some worry about it constantly, and others simply carry on as best they can. The servants often heard these concerns before anyone else, moving quietly through halls and dining rooms. They overheard conversations that guests assumed were private. They listened as nobles debated events unfolding beyond the palace gates. They carried messages, delivered letters, and witnessed countless exchanges that never appeared in official records. In many ways, servants possessed a unique view of Versailles, seeing both its public grandeur and its private anxieties. Meanwhile, the famous dinners continued. Roasted meats arrived on silver platters. Wine flowed into crystal glasses. Musicians performed in nearby chambers. At a glance, everything appeared unchanged. Yet beneath the polished surface, uncertainty lingered like a distant storm cloud slowly darkening the horizon. Foreign ambassadors paid close attention to these developments. Many sent detailed reports back to their governments describing the shifting mood at court. Some expressed surprise that life at Versailles remained so ceremonial despite growing problems elsewhere in the kingdom. Others noted the contrast between the luxury of the palace and the difficulties experienced by many ordinary citizens. Lebac. It is tempting to imagine that everyone should have recognized what was coming. But history is rarely so clear when it is being lived. Most people focus on immediate concerns. They think on secunda obligations, next week's plans, or next month's celebrations. The larger forces reshaping society often remain invisible until they can no longer be ignored. As another evening settles over Versailles, candles flicker softly against mirrors and gilded walls. Guests speak in hushed voices. Servants move carefully between tables. Somewhere beyond the palace grounds, France continues to change. The great palace still shines brightly. But the world around, it is no longer the same world that existed when these traditions first began. And with each passing dinner, the distance between the old age and the new one grows just a little smaller. The courtiers gathered around those magnificent tables could not know that future generations would study their world with fascination. They could not know that the palace would one day become a museum rather than a royal home. They simply lived their lives, navigating the customs, challenges, and expectations of their time. And so, for one more evening, the dining halls of Versailles glow with candlelight. Laughter drifts softly through the air. Silver dishes shine upon the tables. Beyond the windows, darkness settles gently over the gardens, while the palace continues its nightly performance, unaware that history is quietly drawing nearer with every passing year. As the years passed, the distance between Versailles and the rest of France seemed to grow wider. Inside the palace, life continued according to schedules that had changed little over decades. Ceremonies began at precise times. Meals followed familiar patterns. Courtiers competed for attention and favour, just as their parents and grandparents had done before them. Outside, however, many families worried about the price of bread. For ordinary people, food was not part of an elaborate performance. It was a daily necessity. A poor harvest could mean real hardship. A rise in prices could force difficult choices. While nobles discussed etiquette, countless citizens focused on simply feeding their households. Not every courtier was blind to these realities. Some recognized that problems were growing. A few warned that reforms were necessary. Yet large institutions often move slowly, especially when those benefiting from the system have little incentive to change it. Versailles remained magnificent, but magnificence alone could not solve the challenges facing the kingdom. Meanwhile, the palace itself required constant maintenance. Roofs needed repairs. Gardens demanded endless care. Fountains consumed enormous amounts of water and labour. Every polished floor, trimmed hedge, and sparkling chandelier represented hours of work performed by people whose names rarely appeared in official records. Visitors continued to arrive from across Europe, marvelling at what they saw. Even critics often admitted that Versailles was unlike anything else in the world. The scale was overwhelming. The architecture inspired admiration. The dinners remained famous for their luxury and complexity. Yet, beneath the admiration, some visitors sensed that the palace represented a world increasingly out of step with changing times. Still, on countless evenings, none of this seemed urgent. Guests gathered beneath glittering chandeliers. Music echoed softly through vast rooms. Wine was poured. Conversations drifted from politics to fashion, from gossip to personal ambitions. For a few hours, the outside world felt very far away. And perhaps that is why the story of Versailles remains so fascinating. It was both extraordinary and fragile. The future that was approaching. Versailles did not arrive with a single knock at the gate. Instead, it crept closer day by day, carried in newspapers, letters, rumours, and anxious conversations. What had once seemed impossible slowly became imaginable. Ideas that would have been dismissed only a few years earlier were now discussed openly in towns, cities, and even among some members of the nobility themselves. Inside the palace, however, tradition remained powerful. The routines of court life had been repeated for so many generations that they felt almost timeless. Servants still arranged tables with meticulous care. Officials still organised ceremonies according to rules that had existed for decades. Guests still dressed in elaborate clothing and attended dinners, where every gesture carried social meaning. There is something strangely comforting about routine. Even when uncertainty grows, familiar habits create the illusion that everything is under control. Perhaps that is why life at Versailles continued for as long as it did. The palace was not merely a building. It was a system of rituals designed to make the world feel orderly and predictable. Yet beyond the walls, many people no longer viewed Versailles with admiration. To some, it had become a symbol of inequality and excess. Stories about lavish banquets spread far beyond the royal court. Tales of enormous feasts and luxurious lifestyles sounded very different to families struggling to afford basic necessities. Whether those stories were entirely accurate mattered less than the emotions they inspired. The contrast grew sharper with each passing year, and still the dinners continued. Imagine entering one of the great dining halls on a quiet evening during these final years. Candles flicker in hundreds of holders. Silver gleams beneath the warm light. Voices echo softly from distant corners of the room. Servants move with practiced precision, carrying dishes prepared by cooks who have spent hours near blazing fires. To a visitor unfamiliar with the political situation, everything might appear perfectly normal. That is one of history's greatest ironies. The most dramatic changes often begin while ordinary life still seems unchanged. People continue eating dinner, making plans, and discussing everyday concerns, unaware that future generations will view these moments as the closing scenes of an entire era. As another meal comes to an end, chairs slide gently across polished floors. Conversations fade. Guests offer farewells and disappear into the maze of corridors leading to their apartments. One by one, candles are extinguished. Shadows grow longer. Silence slowly settles over the palace. For now, Versailles still stands at the centre of its world. But that world is becoming smaller with every passing day. And somewhere beyond the darkness, history is preparing to turn the page. History was indeed preparing to turn the page. But the people living through those days could not see the chapter title. Waiting ahead. To them, tomorrow still looked much like yesterday. There would be meetings, ceremonies, dinners, and endless social obligations. The familiar rhythm of Versailles continued, even as the foundations beneath it slowly weakened. Many courtiers spent there, evenings discussing matters that now seem surprisingly ordinary. They worried about marriages, inheritances, personal rivalries, and opportunities for advancement. A misplaced comment at dinner could still cause more immediate concern than the political changes unfolding beyond the palace walls. Human attention naturally focuses on what feels closest. And for most residents of Versailles, court life remained their entire universe. Meanwhile, the palace itself seemed almost alive. Its corridors carried whispers from room to room. Footsteps echoed across marble floors. Doors opened and closed hundreds of times each day. Servants hurried through hidden passageways, while nobles strolled through grand galleries, decorated with paintings celebrating the achievements of past kings. At night, when most guests had retired, Versailles became a very different place. The crowds disappeared. The music stopped. The endless conversations finally faded away. Only a small number of workers remained awake, tending fires, cleaning rooms, preparing for the next day. In those quiet hours, the palace must have felt enormous. Imagine standing alone in one of the great halls long after midnight. The candles have nearly burned out. Shadows stretch across the floor. The mirrors reflect only darkness and the faint glow of a few remaining flames. The room that seemed so lively just hours earlier now feels silent and almost mysterious. It is during moments like these that history feels closest. The palace had witnessed countless dinners, celebrations, and ceremonies. It had seen generations come and go. Young nobles had arrived full of ambition, grown old within its walls, and eventually disappeared from the stage of history. Yet Versailles remained, watching silently as one life replaced another. Perhaps that is why the story of Versailles continues to fascinate people centuries later. It was not merely a palace. It was a world unto itself, filled with hopes, fears, ambitions, mistakes, triumphs, and disappointments. Behind every grand banquet stood thousands of individual stories, most of them now forgotten. As another quiet night settles over the palace, a cool breeze moves gently through the gardens outside. The fountains rest, the halls grow still, and somewhere in the darkness, unseen by those sleeping peacefully in their chambers, the dawn of a new age continues its steady approach. And still, life within Versailles moved forward as though the future could wait. Morning sunlight continued to pour through enormous windows, illuminating polished floors and gilded decorations. Servants opened shutters, swept corridors, and prepared rooms for another day of royal routine. From a distance, everything appeared unchanged. Yet change rarely announces itself loudly at first. For many people living at court, the palace had become the centre of reality itself. News from distant provinces felt abstract, compared to the immediate concerns of daily life. A disagreement between noble families, an important invitation, or a conversation with someone influential often seemed far more urgent than reports arriving from outside the palace grounds. The gardens reflected this same illusion of permanence. Carefully trimmed trees lined broad pathways. Statues stood motionless beside fountains. Flower beds were arranged according to precise designs. Generations of gardeners had worked tirelessly to maintain this appearance of perfect order. Nature itself seemed disciplined within the boundaries of Versailles. But even the gardens revealed an important truth. No matter how carefully they were maintained, they required constant effort. Leave them unattended for only a short time, and nature would begin reclaiming the space. Weeds would appear. Hedges would lose their shape. Pathways would slowly disappear beneath new growth. In many ways, court life was similar. The elaborate customs, ceremonies, and traditions that defined Versailles depended upon endless maintenance. Every rule had to be remembered. Every ritual had to be repeated. Every generation had to teach the next how the system worked. Without that effort, the entire structure could gradually unravel. As evening approached once again, preparations for dinner began. Kitchens filled with activity. Fires crackled beneath enormous pots. Knives chopped vegetables with rhythmic precision. Bakers removed fresh loaves from ovens. The familiar sounds of preparation echoed through rooms hidden from most guests. Soon the dining halls would fill again. Guests would arrive dressed in silk and lace. Conversations would begin. Servants would glide between tables carrying carefully prepared dishes. Laughter would rise toward painted ceilings. For a few hours, the world beyond the palace walls would seem very far away. Yet history has a curious habit of moving forward regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. Somewhere beyond Versailles, ordinary people were living lives very different from those of the court. They could not see the glittering chandeliers or taste the elaborate meals. Their concerns were simpler and often more urgent. And with each passing month, the distance between these two worlds continued to grow. For now, however, the candles still burn brightly. The palace still glows against the night. The music still plays softly through distant corridors. And Versailles Noir continues one more evening beneath the stars. As the seasons changed, Versailles continued to exist in a strange balance between certainty and uncertainty. The palace remained beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than ever. Visitors still marvelled at its scale. Foreign dignitaries still carried stories of its splendour back to their homelands. Artists continued painting its halls, gardens and ceremonies, preserving images of a world that seemed destined to last forever. Yet appearances can be deceptive. Many of the people attending these grand dinners were keenly aware of how important appearances had become. Clothing needed to look perfect, even when finances were strained. Smiles needed to appear genuine, even when worries lingered beneath the surface. Confidence needed to be displayed, even when doubts quietly occupied the mind. Court life was, in many ways, a performance that never truly ended. This constant performance could be exhausting. Some memoirs written years later describe the relief people felt when they were finally alone, away from crowded halls and formal gatherings. They could remove heavy clothing, abandon complicated etiquette, and simply be themselves for a few precious hours. Behind every elegant noble stood an ordinary person who sometimes felt tired, frustrated, uncertain, or overwhelmed. The servants understood this perhaps better than anyone. They witnessed people at their most polished and at their most human. They saw powerful individuals worrying over small problems. They heard private complaints after public displays of confidence. The contrast revealed a simple truth, regardless of status. Everyone carried their own burdens. Meanwhile, the palace itself never seemed to rest. Even after midnight, activity continued somewhere within its vast walls. Guards walked their routes. Kitchen staff prepared for the following day. Messengers arrived with news from distant places. Workers repaired furniture, cleaned rooms, and maintained countless details that allowed Versailles to function smoothly. To keep such a place running required an enormous amount of effort, much of it invisible. Visitors saw the finished result, but rarely the labour behind it. They admired sparkling chandeliers without thinking about who cleaned them. They enjoyed magnificent meals without seeing the hours of preparation. They walked through immaculate gardens without considering the gardeners who worked tirelessly to maintain them. Perhaps that is one reason the story of Versailles remains so compelling. It was not only a symbol of wealth and power, it was also a testament to human effort on a remarkable scale. Thousands of people, famous and forgotten alike, contributed to its daily life. And so another evening passes. The final guests leave the dining halls. Candles burn lower. Conversations fade into distant echoes. Above the palace, the night sky stretches silently overhead, unchanged by the ambitions and concerns of those below. And while the residents of Versailles settle into sleep, history continues moving forward, patient and unstoppable, one quiet day at a time. There was also another side of Versailles that visitors rarely saw. A quieter world hidden behind grand ceremonies and public displays. Beyond the famous dining halls and glittering galleries existed a maze of service corridors, storage rooms, workshops, and kitchens that functioned almost like a small city. Hundreds of people spent their entire lives working in these spaces, ensuring that the visible world of the palace continued without interruption. Many workers rose before dawn. Their day began while much of the court still slept beneath heavy curtains and elaborate canopies. Bakers prepared bread for the morning. Stable hands cared for horses. Laundry workers faced mountains of clothing that required cleaning, mending, and pressing. Every task seemed small on its own. Yet together they sustained the immense machine that was Versailles. The contrast between public splendour and private labour fascinated some foreign observers. Several ambassadors recorded how surprised they were to discover the sheer number of people required to maintain the palace. A dinner that appeared effortless. 2 guests might represent days of planning and preparation. Behind every polished silver dish stood cooks, cleaners, porters, and servants whose work remained largely invisible. Ivre de femme, candlelight that illuminated. Evening banquets demandait constant attention. Thousands of candles were used throughout the palace. They needed to be replaced, trimmed, lit and monitored. Workers moved quietly through rooms, ensuring that darkness never interrupted the carefully crafted atmosphere. Elegance and refinement. And yet, despite all this effort, Versailles remained vulnerable to the same passage of time that affects every human creation. Fabrics wore out. Furniture required repairs. Paint faded. Gardens needed replanting. Nothing remained perfect forever. The palace's beauty depended upon continuous renewal. Perhaps that is why so many accounts from the period feel strangely human despite the extraordinary setting. Beneath the gold leaf and marble, people confronted familiar challenges. They worried about the future. They struggled with responsibilities. They hoped for success and feared failure. The surroundings were magnificent, but the emotions were timeless. As another day draws toward its conclusion, the palace settles into its evening rhythm once more. The kitchens grow busy. Footsteps echo through long corridors. Candles flicker to life one by one. Outside, the gardens rest beneath the fading light of the setting sun. For now, the world of Versailles continues exactly as it always has. The routines remain intact. The ceremonies continue. The great halls still welcome their guests. Beyond the walls of Versailles, entire generations lived and died without ever seeing the palace in person. For many ordinary people across France, Versailles existed almost like a legend. They heard stories about its vast halls, its fountains, its gardens, and its extravagant dinners. But few could imagine the true scale of the place. Travellers carried tales from one town to another, often exaggerating details until reality and rumour became difficult to separate. Inside the palace, however, daily life felt far less mythical. Residents quickly became accustomed to sights that would have astonished outsiders. A hall lined with mirrors, a banquet featuring dozens of dishes, or a gathering attended by some of the most powerful people in Europe, gradually became part of everyday existence. Human beings have a remarkable ability to adapt, even to extraordinary circumstances. This familiarity sometimes produced unexpected effects. Courtiers who had spent years at Versailles occasionally became bored by luxuries that visitors found breathtaking. What impressed newcomers often seemed routine to long-time residents. A magnificent feast might be, discussed less for its beauty than for minor flaws in service or seating arrangements. A dazzling ceremony might be remembered because someone arrived late or wore an unfashionable outfit. Such details reveal something important about human nature. No matter how grand our surroundings become, we eventually begin treating them as normal. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. The palace gardens offered a perfect example. Visitors often described them with amazement. They admired the geometric pathways, sculpted trees, and carefully planned vistas stretching toward the horizon. Yet many residents simply walked through these spaces on their way to appointments or social engagements, scarcely noticing the beauty around them. Perhaps this is why the personal letters left behind by people who lived at Versailles remain so valuable. They remind us that history is not only made of kings, revolutions, and famous events. It is also made of ordinary moments. A complaint about the weather, a joke shared during dinner, a servant rushing to complete a task before sunset. These small experiences formed the fabric of daily life. As darkness settles over the palace once more, lanterns glow along pathways and candlelight flickers through tall windows. Somewhere in the kitchens, preparations continue. Somewhere in the gardens, a night breeze moves softly through the trees. Somewhere in the palace, a tired servant finally finishes a long day's work. And while the residents of Versailles focus on the concerns of tomorrow, the years continue passing quietly around them, carrying the palace ever closer to a future none of them can fully imagine. The world remains calm for now, but time never stands still. Even in the grandest palace on earth, time moved differently at Versailles. Days were filled with activity, yet years seemed to pass almost unnoticed. A young noble might arrive at court full of ambition, determined to win influence and recognition. Before long, those years of striving would blend together into a sequence of dinners, ceremonies, conversations, and obligations. Then one day, that same person might realise that decades had passed within the palace walls. The servants experienced time differently. Their lives were measured not by court appointments or social gatherings, but by work. Each day brought familiar responsibilities. Floors needed cleaning. Fires needed tending. Meals needed preparing. Guests needed serving. While nobles often sought distinction and prestige, many workers simply hoped for stability, a reliable position, and enough income to support their families. Despite these differences, everyone at Versailles shared one thing. They existed within a world governed by routine. The palace operated according to countless schedules and traditions that repeated again and again. Seasons changed, but the ceremonies remained. New faces arrived, but the customs endured. Life continued in patterns that seemed permanent. Yet permanence is often an illusion. Even the palace's famous gardens offered a reminder of this truth. Trees planted by one generation matured under the care of another. Flowers bloomed brilliantly for a short time before fading. Leaves turned golden and fell each autumn. Nature quietly demonstrated the cycle of change that no amount of human planning could fully control. Some residents undoubtedly sensed this on a personal level. They watched friends grow older. They witnessed the rise and fall of influential families. They observed how quickly fortunes could change. A person celebrated one year might be forgotten the next. Favour at court could be gained slowly and lost suddenly. Still, every evening the palace seemed determined to defy time itself. Candles illuminated grand halls. Music echoed through galleries. Silver and crystal sparkled on dining tables. Guests laughed, debated, and shared stories just as countless others had done before them. The atmosphere encouraged the comforting belief that tomorrow would look much like today. As another night settles over Versailles, the sounds of the day gradually fade away. The kitchens grow quieter. Footsteps become less frequent. The final conversations drift into silence. Above the palace, stars appear one by one in the dark sky, indifferent to the ambitions and worries of those below. And while the residents of Versailles prepare for another day of familiar routines, history continues its patient journey forward. Slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the world beyond the palace walls keeps changing, drawing ever closer to a moment that will transform everything they know. The people of Versailles could not know that future generations would study their lives in such detail. They could not imagine historians carefully reading their letters, examining their diaries, or analysing records of dinners that seemed ordinary to those who attended them. To the men and women living there, each day simply felt like another day in an endless sequence of similar days. One of the most fascinating aspects of life at Versailles was how much energy people devoted to being seen. Presence mattered. Visibility mattered. A person who remained absent for too long risked being forgotten. Attending dinners, ceremonies, and social gatherings was not merely entertainment. It was a way of maintaining one's place within the complicated hierarchy of court life. This created a constant pressure to participate, even when someone felt tired, ill, or overwhelmed. There was often an expectation that they would still appear in public. A missed event might spark rumours. An empty chair at an important dinner could become the subject of speculation. Court life rewarded visibility and punished absence. Yet, behind closed doors, many individuals longed for moments of peace. Letters from the period occasionally reveal a surprising desire for simplicity. Some nobles expressed affection for quieter country residences, where life moved at a slower pace. Others cherished rare opportunities to escape the endless formalities that dominated existence at Versailles. The palace itself seemed to contain two separate worlds. One was public and dazzling, filled with ceremonies, music, elegant clothing, and magnificent displays of wealth. The other was private and far more human, a world of exhaustion, worries, friendships, disappointments, and ordinary conversations. Perhaps this is why the story of Versailles continues to feel so relatable despite the centuries that separate us from it. The setting was extraordinary, but the people were not so different from ourselves. They worried about their futures. They sought approval from others. They celebrated successes and feared failures. They laughed with friends and struggled through difficult days. As evening falls once more, the familiar preparations begin. Servants light candles throughout the palace. Kitchens come alive with activity. Footmen move through corridors carrying messages and supplies. Guests adjust their clothing and prepare for another evening of conversation and ceremony. Outside, the gardens grow quiet beneath the fading light. A gentle breeze passes through rows of carefully maintained trees. The fountains reflect the colours of the setting sun. For now, Versailles remains exactly what it has been for generations, a place of ritual, ambition, beauty, and endless performance. Yet time continues its patient work. Another day passes. Another dinner concludes. Another page of history turns, bringing the palace one step closer to the dramatic events waiting just beyond the horizon. And still, despite all the pressures and expectations, people continued arriving at Versailles with dreams. Young nobles travelled from distant provinces hoping to build connections, gain influence, and secure their future. Families invested enormous effort into establishing a presence at court because they believed opportunity lived within these walls. To many, Versailles was not simply a palace. It was the gateway to advancement. The competition was relentless. Every conversation could matter. Every introduction could open a door. Every dinner invitation carried potential significance. People paid close attention to who sat beside whom, who received invitations, and who appeared to be gaining favour. Relationships were carefully cultivated, sometimes over months or even years. Patience was often just as valuable as ambition. Yet success remained uncertain. Many individuals spent decades navigating court life without achieving the influence they desired. Others rose rapidly through a combination of talent, luck, and timing. The palace rewarded some while quietly overlooking many others. As in any competitive environment, there were far more hopeful participants than available opportunities. Meanwhile, servants observed much of this from the edges of the room. They watched guests celebrate victories and endure disappointments. They witnessed friendships form and rivalries develop. Because they moved throughout the palace, they often saw patterns invisible to those focused only on their own ambitions. The dining halls provided a perfect stage for these social dramas. Beneath sparkling chandeliers, alliances strengthened over shared meals. Disagreements were softened through polite conversation. Information passed quietly from one person to another. Sometimes the most important events of the evening occurred not during official ceremonies but during brief exchanges between individuals seated near each other at the table. Food, therefore, served more than one purpose. It nourished the body, certainly, but it also created opportunities for interaction. A dinner at Versailles was part meal, part performance, and part political gathering. Guests understood this instinctively. Every appearance carried meaning. As midnight approaches, However, even the busiest court must eventually slow. The music becomes quieter. The conversations grow fewer. Candles burn lower in their holders. One by one, guests withdraw from the halls and disappear into private apartments. A great stillness gradually settles across the palace. For a few precious hours, the endless competition pauses. The servants rest. The courtiers sleep. The corridors grow silent. Only the faint glow of a few remaining lights breaks the darkness. And in that silence, Versailles seems almost timeless, suspended between past and future, unaware that each passing night brings it closer to the moment when the world it represents will begin to fade into history. Eventually, every great story reaches its final chapter, not because the people within it realise the ending has arrived, but because time quietly continues its work. The residents of Versailles could not see the centuries ahead. They could not know that one day millions of visitors would walk through these halls, pausing to admire rooms that once felt entirely ordinary to those who lived there. The dinners ended. The conversations faded. The candles burned down to pools of cooling wax. And yet, in a sense, the palace never truly disappeared. The voices are gone now, but their words remain preserved in letters and journals. The meals have long since been eaten, but descriptions of them survive in fragile pages carefully protected by historians. The guests have vanished into the past, but their stories still echo through the corridors they once walked. Perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about Versailles. It was built to display power and wealth. Yet what survived most clearly were the human details. A servant complaining about sore feet after a long evening. A visitor struggling to understand complicated court etiquette. A nervous young noble attending an important dinner for the first time. Oh, tired courtier secretly wishing for a quiet night away from the endless ceremonies. These small moments bridge the distance between their world and ours. Because beneath the silk gowns, powdered wigs, golden decorations, and elaborate feasts were people not so different from us. They hoped, worried, laughed, dreamed, and sometimes felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon them. They lived their lives one day at a time, unaware that future generations would look back upon their world with fascination. Tonight, however, the palace is finally quiet. The dining tables have been cleared. The musicians have packed away their instruments. The servants have finished their duties. The guests have retired to their rooms. Outside, the gardens rest beneath the gentle darkness of the night sky. A cool breeze drifts across the pathways where countless footsteps once passed. The fountains stand still. The windows reflect only moonlight. And as we leave Versailles behind, we can allow the noise and ambition of court life to fade into the distance. The glittering halls grow dimmer. The voices become softer. The candles flicker one final time before disappearing into darkness. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most extraordinary palaces. As the great doors of Versailles close gently behind us, we leave its grand dinners, hidden struggles, and forgotten stories where they belong in the quiet embrace of the past. Now the palace sleeps, and perhaps, after such a long evening at Versailles, it is finally time for us to sleep as well. Good night.